Matthew and Evelyn had a life most people envied, a beautiful home, a loving marriage, and their son Logan, who brought endless joy to their days. But a sudden tragedy shattered their world, plunging Evelyn into a deep depression and leaving their once happy home in ruins. Desperate to hold on to hope, Matthew encounters a young homeless boy named Ethan and brings him into their lives, unknowingly setting in motion a chain of events that will change them forever. As they struggle to heal from their grief, Ethan becomes the spark that reignites love and purpose in their broken hearts. But will the light of this new beginning be enough to overcome the darkness of their past? It was the kind of house that once radiated happiness, with laughter seeping from its walls like sunlight. Matthew and Evelyn had built a life many envied. Their home, nestled in a quiet suburb surrounded by towering oak trees, was filled with warmth and joy. Together they had created a space that brimmed with life, where each room held traces of love, from the kitchen where Matthew made pancakes on Sunday mornings, to the backyard where Evelyn tended to her garden. Their marriage, too, was a source of admiration, a partnership built on deep love, respect, and shared dreams. But the heart of their world was their 6-year-old son, Logan. A child whose boundless imagination seemed to know no limits, Logan had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel extraordinary. His laughter, bright and infectious, echoed through the house from dawn until dusk. Every day with Logan was an adventure. Whether it was constructing elaborate forts out of pillows or exploring the nearby woods, searching for hidden treasures that only a child could see, Logan had a curiosity that knew no bounds. Mornings in their household were filled with his endless questions. Dad, why do the stars shine? Mom, how do birds know how to fly? He was always eager to learn, his wide eyes absorbing everything around him. Matthew, who woke early to make breakfast before work, often found himself trying to keep up with Logan's rapid-fire inquiries as he flipped pancakes. Dad, how come planes don't fall from the sky? Well, Matthew would begin, always eager to indulge his son's curiosity. It's all about aerodynamics. What? Matthew would laugh, ruffling Logan's hair, as Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching the two of them with a soft smile, a coffee mug cradled in her hands. The peace of those moments felt almost eternal, as though nothing could touch them. On weekends, the three of them often spent time outdoors. Logan would run ahead of his parents at the park, his laughter bouncing off the trees as he chased squirrels or collected rocks for his ever-growing collection. Evelyn and Matthew would follow behind, hand in hand, talking about the future. Sometimes they spoke about adding to their family, about having another child, or maybe even adopting a dog. The possibilities seemed endless, and the future was bright. Life felt solid, grounded, like the roots of the ancient oaks that lined their street. But life, as they would soon learn, is never as stable as it seems. It was a warm spring day, and the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. Evelyn had decided to take Logan to the park alone so that Matthew could stay home and finish a project he had been working on for weeks. She packed a small picnic, planning to spend the afternoon basking in the sun while Logan burned off his endless energy. Before they left, Matthew kissed them both goodbye at the door, promising to join them later, never imagining that this would be the last time he would see his son's bright, infectious smile. The day at the park was perfect. Logan ran ahead, his small legs carrying him faster than Evelyn could keep up with, but she didn't mind. She watched with a heart full of love as he played, his face alight with pure joy. They spent hours chasing after a ball, sharing ice cream cones and laying on the grass, watching the clouds float by. As the sun began to set, they made their way back to the car, Logan still bouncing with energy. As they walked, Evelyn bent down to wipe a smudge of ice cream from Logan's face, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had filled her life with so much happiness. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her back and the weight of a perfect day settling in her chest. "I love you so much, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with affection. Logan beamed, his eyes sparkling in the fading light. "I love you too, Mommy," he replied, wrapping his arms tightly around her neck in a hug that made time feel like it was standing still. It was a moment of pure bliss, a moment that, in Evelyn's memory, would always feel suspended in time. But the peace of that moment was violently shattered in the next instant. A car, speeding down the narrow street faster than it should have been, suddenly veered out of control. Evelyn didn't have time to think. Her instincts took over, and with every ounce of strength in her body, she shoved Logan out of the car's path. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, and then silence. Time stopped. Evelyn's world dissolved into chaos. The sound of sirens blurred into the background, her vision dimming as she struggled to stay conscious. She could hear voices, strangers shouting, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was Logan. She tried to move, to stand, but her body betrayed her. Pain shot through her, but it wasn't the physical pain that broke her. It was the fear, the overwhelming, suffocating fear that Logan was gone. By the time Matthew arrived at the hospital, his heart pounding with dread, it was already too late. A doctor with a clinical detachment delivered the news that shattered Matthew's world. Logan had not survived. The life they had built, the family they had cherished, crumbled in an instant. Evelyn had survived physically, but the woman who was wheeled out of the hospital days later was not the same woman who had walked into that park with their son. Her body had healed, but her soul had been irrevocably shattered. At first there was shock, a numbness that clouded everything. Evelyn barely spoke. The light that had once danced in her eyes was gone, replaced by a haunting emptiness. Matthew tried everything. He cooked her favorite meals, bought her flowers, suggested counseling, but nothing worked. She was lost in a world of guilt and despair, drowning in memories of that terrible day. Their once joyful home, filled with laughter and love, became a mausoleum of memories. Logan's toys were left untouched, his room frozen in time. Every photo on the wall, every trace of their son's existence, was a reminder of what they had lost. The silence was unbearable, and yet it filled every corner of the house. Without Logan, without Evelyn, Matthew felt as though the world was collapsing in on him. Months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and lonely mornings. Matthew clung to the hope that Evelyn would come back to him, that one day she would smile at him again or ask how his day had been. But each time he came home, he was met with the same heavy silence. The world outside continued to move on, but inside their home, time had stopped. One afternoon, after a particularly long day at work, Matthew found himself wandering aimlessly through the city. He had no destination in mind, just a desperate need to escape the oppressive weight of his grief. As he walked, the gleaming suburban streets faded into the rougher edges of the city, and it was there, on a dirty street corner, that he saw him. A small boy, no older than 7, sat huddled against the wall of a building, his clothes dirty and his face streaked with grime. His eyes, large, sad, and hauntingly familiar, were fixed on the ground, as though he were trying to disappear. And in that moment, something inside Matthew shifted. Matthew stood in the quiet kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the fridge. Ethan sat at the table, watching him with wide, unsure eyes. There was a fragile silence between them, broken only by the soft clinking of dishes as Matthew prepared a simple meal. Leftovers, pasta from the night before, a few slices of bread, nothing special, but it would have to do. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had just done. He had brought a stranger, a child, into their broken home, a home that had barely held itself together since Logan's death. What was he thinking? Would Evelyn ever come around to this? "Here you go, Ethan," Matthew said quietly, placing a plate of food in front of the boy. "Eat up, okay?" Ethan nodded silently and began to eat, his movements slow and cautious, as though he wasn't used to having someone serve him a hot meal. Matthew sat across from him, watching as Ethan picked at his food. The boy's thin frame and hollow cheeks made Matthew's heart ache. How long had he been out there, alone? What kind of life had he been living before now? Matthew wanted to ask, but he held back, sensing that pushing too hard, too soon, would only scare Ethan. Instead, they ate in silence, the weight of the house pressing down on both of them. Every corner of the home felt haunted by Logan's absence, a constant reminder of what they had lost. And yet, as Matthew watched Ethan take slow bites of food, he couldn't help but feel something stir inside him, an echo of the purpose he had once felt as a father, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, helping this boy could bring some light back into their lives. After dinner, Matthew showed Ethan to the guest room, a small, unused space that had once been intended as a second child's room. The thought hit him hard. They had planned for another child, back when everything was normal, back when the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. But now the room stood empty, gathering dust, a reminder of dreams that had been shattered. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, looking unsure of what to do next. His small hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, his eyes darting around the room. "Do you want to take a shower?" Matthew asked gently. "I can get you some fresh clothes." Ethan nodded slowly, still not saying much. His silence was unnerving, but Matthew didn't push him. He found an old set of Logan's clothes, something that hadn't been touched in months, and handed them to Ethan, his throat tightening as he did. The clothes were clean, but they carried the weight of memories too painful to speak of. As Ethan disappeared into the bathroom, Matthew sank into a chair in the hallway, rubbing his hands over his face. He couldn't ignore the rising anxiety in his chest. What had he just done? He hadn't even told Evelyn everything. He hadn't told her that he wanted this boy to stay, to be part of their lives, even if only temporarily. But Evelyn hadn't seemed to notice, hadn't seemed to care about much of anything lately. Matthew clenched his fists, the helplessness settling over him once more. He had hoped that bringing Ethan into the house might stir something in Evelyn, might pull her out of the deep fog she had been living in. But so far, there was nothing. Just the same blank stare, the same vacant expression that had haunted their lives for months. When Ethan finally emerged from the bathroom, his hair damp and his face clean, he looked like a different child. The dirt had been washed away, but the sadness in his eyes remained. He wore Logan's clothes, and Matthew felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of grief and guilt. Could Evelyn handle this? Could he? "Do you want to sleep now?" Matthew asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ethan nodded, climbing into the bed without a word. Matthew pulled the blanket over him, tucking it in gently, just as he used to do with Logan. The routine felt both comforting and unbearable at the same time. "Good night, Ethan," Matthew whispered, his voice breaking slightly. The boy didn't respond, simply closing his eyes and turning toward the wall. Matthew stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, before finally retreating to his own room, where Evelyn still sat, unmoving. As the days passed, Ethan settled into their home, though it wasn't without its challenges. At first, the boy was quiet, almost invisible, as though afraid of taking up space. He stayed close to Matthew, following him around the house, but never asking for anything. He didn't touch the toys that remained in Logan's room, didn't explore the house as Logan once had. He seemed to understand in some unspoken way that this was a place filled with grief. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when Matthew saw glimmers of the child Ethan must have been before. One afternoon, Matthew found him in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the porch, watching the birds flit from tree to tree. Ethan's face had a softness to it, a quiet wonder that reminded Matthew so much of Logan that it hurt. "You like birds?" Matthew asked, sitting down beside him. Ethan nodded, his gaze following a sparrow as it hopped along the fence. "I used to watch them with my mom," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said they're free. They can go anywhere they want." Matthew's heart clenched at the mention of Ethan's mother. He hadn't asked much about Ethan's past, unsure of how to broach the subject. But now, sitting beside the boy in the fading light of the afternoon, he couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him, what had brought him to that street corner, alone and abandoned. "Where is your mom now?" Matthew asked gently, unsure if Ethan would answer. For a long time, Ethan said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the birds, his small hands gripping the edge of the porch. "She's gone," he whispered finally. "She left. I don't know where." The words were like a knife to Matthew's chest. He didn't push further, knowing that the pain of abandonment, of loss, was something Ethan would have to reveal in his own time. But it hurt deeply to see such a young boy carry the weight of a broken heart. As the weeks went by, Ethan began to open up a little more, though his progress was slow and hesitant. He would help Matthew in the kitchen, setting the table or carrying dishes, and sometimes, when the mood was right, He would tell Matthew small stories about his life before, about his mother's laugh, about how they used to sit by the window and watch the rain. But whenever the subject of his father came up, Ethan would fall silent, retreating back into himself. It wasn't just Ethan who was changing. Matthew noticed subtle shifts in Evelyn too, though they were almost imperceptible at first. She still spent most of her time in a daze, barely engaging with Matthew or Ethan. But every now and then, Matthew would catch her watching from the window as Ethan played outside, or hear her pause as she passed by the kitchen when Ethan's soft laughter filled the room. There were moments when her gaze seemed to linger on the boy, as though some small part of her was waking up, remembering what it was like to care. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Evelyn remained locked in her own world, her grief too deep to easily break through. Matthew wasn't sure how long he could continue like this, torn between caring for Ethan and trying to reach the woman he loved, the woman who had once been so full of life. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. Matthew was working in his home office, catching up on emails when he heard it, a sound he hadn't heard in months. At first, he thought he was imagining it, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he stood up and walked toward the living room, the sound grew louder, more distinct. Laughter. It was light, hesitant, but unmistakable. It wasn't his own. He hadn't laughed in so long he wasn't sure he even knew how anymore, but it filled the house, echoing off the walls like music. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the living room doorway. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. Evelyn was sitting on the floor, her legs crossed, with Ethan beside her. They were looking at a piece of paper, a drawing that Ethan had made earlier that day. It was simple, a child's drawing of a family, Matthew, Evelyn, and Ethan, all holding hands in front of the house. The figures were crude, stick-like, but the message was clear. "This is you," Ethan was saying, pointing at one of the figures. "And this is Matthew, and that's me. We're all together." Evelyn's lips twitched, the corners of her mouth curving upward in the faintest hint of a smile. Her fingers traced the lines of the drawing, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. For the first time in months, Evelyn looked alive. She looked like the woman Matthew had married, the woman who had loved their son with every fiber of her being. And as she sat there holding the drawing, something inside her seemed to shift, to awaken from the deep slumber of grief that had consumed her. Matthew stood frozen in the doorway, not daring to move, not daring to speak, for fear of shattering the fragile moment. His heart swelled with a mixture of relief, hope, and something else. Something that had been missing for so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like. Love. Ethan had brought something back into their lives, something Matthew had thought was lost forever. And as he watched his wife, his broken, beautiful wife, begin to heal, begin to open her heart once more, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this little boy had been the answer all along. The following weeks were a turning point. Though the house still carried the heavy presence of grief, there were now small signs of life, flickers of something more. Evelyn began to emerge from the shell of her depression, little by little. She started interacting with Ethan more, watching him play in the yard, joining him for meals, and even reading a book to him one night. Her voice, still soft and hesitant, filled the space that had been empty for so long. The silence that had once suffocated their home was beginning to lift. Ethan, too, blossomed in the newfound warmth. His initial hesitation was slowly replaced by laughter and curiosity. He explored the house more freely, spending time with Matthew and Evelyn, though always careful to tread lightly. He seemed to sense the fragility of the household and acted with a sensitivity far beyond his years. But even with these small victories, there remained an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken fear that at any moment, things could collapse again. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Matthew and Evelyn sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the television casting shadows across their faces. It was the first time in months that they had sat in the same room without the oppressive weight of grief pulling them apart. "Evelyn," Matthew began cautiously, breaking the silence. "Ethan, he's starting to feel like a part of our family." His voice wavered slightly, unsure of how to continue. "I think we need to talk about what happens next, about whether he should stay. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She stared down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. The air between them felt charged with uncertainty. Matthew had expected resistance or perhaps more silence, but what he got instead surprised him. "I'm scared, Matt," she whispered, her voice raw. "I don't know if I can go through losing another child. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Her eyes were filled with unshed tears, and for the first time in months she was finally speaking the truth that had haunted her since the accident. Matthew's throat tightened, his heart aching as he listened to her. He moved closer, taking her hand in his. "I'm scared too," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But Ethan, he needs us. And I think maybe we need him too. We can't go back to what we had before, but maybe this is a chance to build something new." For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded, her fingers squeezing Matthew's. "I don't want to lose him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I don't want to lose us either." They sat there together, their hands intertwined, the weight of the decision hanging between them. It was a fragile moment, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they were facing it together. The following days brought a tentative sense of peace. Matthew and Evelyn began discussing what it would mean for Ethan to stay with them long term, the idea of adoption slowly becoming more tangible. But just as they were starting to find their footing, life threw them another curveball. It started innocuously enough. Ethan had developed a mild cough, nothing unusual for the colder months. But within days, the cough worsened and a fever followed. At first, Matthew wasn't too worried. Children got sick all the time. But when Ethan's fever spiked dangerously high one evening, panic set in. Matthew rushed to Ethan's side, his hands trembling as he tried to cool the boy down with damp cloths. Evelyn hovered nearby, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't seen a doctor since Logan's death, hadn't set foot in a hospital since that terrible day. And now the thought of going back, of potentially losing another child, seemed unbearable. But as Ethan's condition worsened, something inside Evelyn snapped. Without a word, she took control. Her hands, though shaking, were steady as she helped Matthew get Ethan into the car. She called the hospital, explaining the symptoms with a calmness that masked the terror she felt inside. The drive to the hospital was tense, the memories of Logan's death looming over them like a dark cloud. The last time they had been in this position, they had lost everything. Matthew's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. But Evelyn sat beside him, silent and resolute, her eyes fixed on Ethan's fragile form in the back seat. At the hospital, they were rushed into the emergency room. The hours that followed were agonizing, filled with the sterile smells of antiseptic and the distant sounds of hospital machines. Matthew paced the waiting room, unable to sit still, while Evelyn stayed close to Ethan, her hands never leaving his small, feverish body. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was reassuring. "Ethan's going to be okay," he said, offering them a smile. "It's a severe case of the flu, but we caught it in time. He'll need to stay overnight for observation, but there's no need to worry." Relief washed over Matthew and Evelyn in a wave so powerful that they both nearly collapsed. They had faced the fear of losing Ethan, and for the first time in months, they had fought together. The bond that had been so fragile before was now stronger, tempered by the fire of shared fear and hope. That night, as they sat by Ethan's bedside, watching him sleep peacefully, Evelyn turned to Matthew, her voice soft but filled with certainty. "We need to adopt him," she said. "He's already ours in every way that matters. It's time to make it official." Matthew's eyes filled with tears. He had thought about it many times, but hearing Evelyn say the words, after everything they had been through, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He nodded, unable to speak, but knowing that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when they would finally begin to heal. The adoption process wasn't as simple as signing papers and moving forward, but that didn't deter Matthew and Evelyn. In fact, the legal hurdles, the home visits from social workers, and the seemingly endless paperwork became a testament to their commitment to Ethan. It was as if every signature, every document signed, was another stitch in the fabric of their healing, another step toward building the family they never thought they'd have again. Ethan, for his part, seemed to sense the shift in the air. Though he had always been a quiet boy, the nervousness that had marked his early began to fade. He no longer tiptoed around the house, afraid of disturbing the fragile balance. He laughed more often, played more freely, and began asking questions that echoed the child they had lost. One evening, as Matthew helped Ethan with his homework at the kitchen table, the boy looked up with those wide, innocent eyes that had first caught Matthew's attention on that street corner months ago. "Do you think Logan would have liked me?" Ethan asked, his voice soft, but filled with an earnestness that caught Matthew off guard. Matthew's breath hitched in his throat. For a moment, the question hung in the air, raw and unanswerable. Logan's memory was still sacred, a wound that hadn't quite healed, but Matthew knew this was a question Ethan needed to ask. More importantly, it was one he needed to answer. "I think Logan would have loved you," Matthew said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He would have loved having someone to play with, someone who shares our home. You're part of our family now, Ethan. You've made this house feel alive again." Ethan smiled softly, nodding as he absorbed Matthew's words. There was no need to say more. They both understood that while Logan's absence would always be felt, Ethan had filled a void in their hearts that no one else could. Evelyn, too, had become more involved in their everyday lives. She wasn't just present, she was there, fully engaged in ways Matthew hadn't seen since before the accident. She and Ethan spent hours together in the garden, planting flowers and pulling weeds, their hands working the soil as they spoke in soft voices about things Matthew didn't always overhear. He would watch them from the window, his heart swelling with gratitude. The woman who had been lost to grief was slowly returning, piece by piece, and Ethan was the reason for it. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan ran up to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Look what I found!" he exclaimed, holding up a tiny bird with a broken wing. The bird fluttered weakly in his hands, and Ethan's expression was a mixture of concern and hope. Evelyn's face softened as she knelt beside him, gently taking the bird into her hands. "We'll help him," she said softly, "just like we've been helping each other." They fashioned a small nest for the bird, and over the next few weeks, Ethan and Evelyn took turns caring for it, nursing it back to health. It was a simple, almost symbolic gesture, but to Matthew, it meant everything. It was as though the bird, with its fragile, broken wing, represented their family, wounded, but healing. And just like the bird, they were learning to fly again. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The adoption was finalized on a bright autumn day, the sun filtering through the courthouse windows as Matthew, Evelyn, and Ethan signed the papers that officially made them a family. It was a quiet ceremony, but the significance of the moment was not lost on any of them. Ethan, with his wide smile and gleaming eyes, looked up at Matthew and Evelyn, his voice full of hope as he asked, "Does this mean I'm really your son now?" Evelyn knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his cheek. "You've been our son from the moment you walked into our lives," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Today just makes it official." Tears filled Ethan's eyes, and for the first time in a long time, Matthew felt that their family, though different from what they had once imagined, was whole again. The anniversary of Logan's death came and went, but this time there was a sense of peace. Matthew and Evelyn took Ethan to the park where they had last been with Logan. It was a bittersweet visit, but instead of the overwhelming grief that had once consumed them, there was a quiet acceptance. They sat on the same bench where Evelyn had last held Logan's hand, watching as Ethan ran through the grass, his laughter echoing across the park. "He would have loved this," Evelyn said softly, her voice full of warmth. "He would have loved Ethan." Matthew nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I think he would have been proud of us too," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for finding a way to keep going, for finding a way to love again." Evelyn rested her head on Matthew's shoulder, a peaceful smile on her lips. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, and for the first time, Matthew believed her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the park, Ethan ran back to them, breathless and laughing. "Look at me," he shouted, his arms spread wide like wings. "I'm flying?" Matthew and Evelyn both laughed, standing to meet him. "You sure are," Matthew said, lifting Ethan into his arms. "And we're right here with you." Together they walked back to their car, their hearts full, their family complete. As they drove home, Matthew glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Ethan's smiling face in the back seat. The warmth that filled his chest was overwhelming. Hope, love, and the realization that, despite the pain they had endured, they had found a new beginning. And this time, they weren't letting go. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your favorite moments with us. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed the story and share it with friends and family who might need a little inspiration today. For more heartwarming and inspiring stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Driven by Stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss out on our next emotional tale. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next story.